As long as I can remember, I've dreamed of being a man. I mean that very literally. When I fell asleep, my dream self was quite different from my physical body, with broader shoulders, a square jaw, larger hands and feet, and a deep voice that filled any room like an upright bass. It wasn't always such a pronounced change, of course. When I was very young, the differences were subtler. The unwanted waking nightmare of sexual dimorphism not yet wholly foisted upon me, but changes were still there. I always felt like something was wrong when I woke up to find myself with the long hair my mother insisted I couldn't cut to the short length I desired. I remember once, after a birthday party, looking at myself in the mirror, wearing a nice, expensive dress I'd received as a gift, and thinking to myself how much happier I'd be wearing the suit I had on in my dreams the night before. Growing up, I didn't have a word for what I was feeling. My family was somewhat strict about my access to the internet and what sorts of films I was allowed to watch, so I lived in a bubble of ignorance about my own identity. It wasn't until high school that I first heard the word transgender, and it came from meeting someone else like me. His name was Timothy, and in all truth, we weren't friends. Nobody was friends with Timothy. Nobody wanted to hang out with the freak. There were many comments like, "So if you're a man, am I allowed to hit you?" Whispered slurs, and exaggerated caricatures drawn on scrap paper and surreptitiously passed around to a chorus of barely contained snickers. I'd like to say I never joined in, but peer pressure is a powerful force, especially when it comes to those of us who desperately want to fit in. I think part of me resented him too, for so flagrantly living the life I wanted to have. He wore a binder to flatten his chest. His hair was short and slicked back with gel, and he always dressed like someone out of a prior age, a holdover from an era of leather jackets, fast cars, and switchblades. I was jealous. Eventually, the bullying got bad enough that one of his bolder tormentors broke his arm. Nobody confessed to the act, and the school's administration was less than cooperative in trying to find out who did it. Timothy's parents wound up pulling him from school, and I never saw him again. My own parents saw it as a relief, saying that he was a dangerous influence, and that his family should have sent him off to a psychologist rather than indulging her delusions. It was the first time I had ever heard them talk about someone like me, and the memory of my own mother and father describing with such vitriol how much they hated Timothy was permanently burned into my developing mind, a scar which I don't think will ever heal. I knew there was never any chance of being accepted by my family. At best, they'd see me as a victim of some perverted campaign to corrupt innocent young women into hating their bodies. At worst, they'd treat me like a delusional freak. Either way, they would still see me as their daughter, and I very much doubt there is anything I could do to change that. After so many years of being forced to hide who I am, I finally had the good fortune of living alone, far away from my parents and their bigotry. It was almost unbearable during the final few months of my living with them, when people like me became a political wedge and the hate-spewing talking heads on the idiot box began telling horror stories of groomers and radical gender ideology. But I managed to get out and find a job. I was finally free to be myself. Well, more or less. I was out publicly to friends and coworkers. I bound my breasts. People called me Victor rather than the stupid name on my driver's license. But in terms of actual medical treatment, I was still stuck at square one. The thing that they don't tell you is it's actually rather difficult to get on hormones, at least if you're a transgender man. Estradiol and the like aren't controlled substances. If worst comes to worst, an uninsured trans woman can get her hands on some hormones via the gray market, and the process of getting a prescription is far quicker. Testosterone, however, is a Schedule III controlled substance, the same tier as anabolic steroids or ketamine. Getting a prescription is a bit more of an involved process, and going through unofficial channels could result in a felony if you get caught. So, finally liberated from my family, I now had to deal with the frustration of the medical system. My crummy job working at a movie theater didn't exactly have the best insurance plan, and by the time I did manage to get in touch with a doctor about getting an appointment set up, I was informed the soonest I could see someone would be several months at least. Without going into too much detail, certain conservative politicians in my state had made it rather difficult to get gender-affirming care via telehealth, out of a fear that it would be too easy for impressionable adolescents to permanently alter their bodies. So I simply had to sit around and twiddle my thumbs, waiting for my turn at one of the rapidly dwindling number of clinics that offered consultations for getting on hormone replacement therapy. Of course, I knew that hormones aren't mandatory for being a real man, and I knew that even if I did manage to get on testosterone, it wouldn't make the bigots any more convinced of my masculinity. But I still couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness whenever I looked in the mirror. The reflection that stared back at me didn't feel right. It didn't feel like me. Do you have any idea how terrible it is to feel trapped in a body which is utterly wrong? To have your own flesh and blood betray you every second of every day? I coped as best as I could, and spending time with supportive friends helped. But really, truly, I think that the most comforting thing throughout this ordeal was my dreams. Even if I couldn't pass as male in the waking world, even if I had to deal with the thank you misses and howdy ma'ams from the customers at work, when I slept, it was as though my mind and body were in perfect alignment. It sometimes felt like my own mind was comforting me, covering me with a blanket of fantasy to soothe the pain. Even in my darkest nightmares, I always had a body that felt like it belonged to me. Though my dreams are especially vivid while they last, I do find they tend to fade quite quickly upon awakening, something which has only seemed to get worse as I get older. To cope with this, I began to write down records of my nocturnal visions, first in a notebook, then later on a blog under the pseudonym of Dysphoric Dreamer 98. I found it easier to reach for my phone to jot down a quick post while the memory was freshest than having to fiddle about with pen and paper. Besides, while my little blog wasn't especially popular or anything, seeing people comment on my posts, especially other trans men, made me happy. It brought me a little joy to know I'm not alone. Now, obviously, I didn't put out any sort of personal information on my blog. No photos, no mention of where I work, not my real name. Hell, not even which state I live in. This is why it was so odd when I found the package on my doorstep one morning, all wrapped up in brown paper and twine, addressed to Dysphoric Dreamer 98. There was no return address, so I had no idea who could have sent it. In a panic, I simply shut the door and left the package outside, running over to my computer to search the web to see if I'd been doxxed or something like that. I didn't think I'd ever said anything particularly controversial, and it wasn't as though I had any sort of wide audience. I wrote a digital dream journal with a follower count in the double digits, for goodness sake. It's not like I was a celebrity. Once I was satisfied that I hadn't had my personal information posted publicly or stolen in a leak of some sort, I opened my front door again and peeked out at the package, feeling oddly nervous, as if worried it was going to sprout teeth and bite me. After I was satisfied that it wasn't going to blow up or catch fire or anything like that, I brought it inside and set it down on my desk, cutting off the twine with my pocket knife and unwrapping it. I was greeted with an old wooden box, of the sort that would be used to hold expensive jewelry. It was covered all over with elaborate ornamentation, a combination of floral and geometric designs. There was something oddly hypnotic about the patterns formed by the embossed flowers and curving lines, and I spent about a minute simply admiring the craftsmanship of the thing before I actually set about opening it. The contents of the box were a small glass vial filled with liquid, a metal syringe that looked as though it were fashioned in the Victorian era, and a note written on very old parchment in elegant-looking cursive. This is what it said. Dear Sir, you've spent every night dreaming of who you truly are. It is time to make those dreams into reality. Inject intramuscularly once per week, 1 milliliter. Expect results in 3-4 weeks. Sincerely, a friend. Now, I'm not stupid. Obviously, I didn't immediately start injecting myself with mysterious fluid I found in a box left on my front door by an anonymous stranger. As a matter of fact, my first thought was that someone was trying to poison me. I didn't know who would want me dead, but given the circumstances, I thought a little bit of paranoia was the healthiest approach to take. Part of me wondered if my family had somehow been informed of my blog and were trying to discreetly assassinate me in order to ensure I'd never be able to medically or legally transition. I didn't have any evidence of this, but it seemed far more logical than there being some hormone-gifting Good Samaritan wandering about leaving vials of testosterone on the doors of disadvantaged trans men. Besides, whatever was contained within the vial didn't look like testosterone, at least not in any form I was familiar with. It was tinged slightly purple and seemed to sparkle when I held it up to the light. I did consider calling the police, but I decided against it. Realistically, all they do is confiscate the box, and I was worried that I could get in trouble if the contents of the vial did end up being some kind of poison or illicit substance. Besides, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. And so, I tried to do my best to forget about the box and its contents. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even my friends, though I'm not entirely sure why that is. I suppose I may have rationalized it as trying to keep myself safe from being reported to the police, but that's not really true. Something about it just felt private to me. Inherently, it was a subject that necessitated secrecy. Its presence kept nagging at me, however, and it never felt like I'd ever be fully able to erase it from my mind. Sometimes, I'd open up the box and just stare at the vial for a while, considering it silently, before shutting the lid and pushing it back under the bed. Regardless, I managed to more or less successfully ignore the box for around a month. It was a combination of many discrete factors that led to me giving in, and even after what I've experienced, and even though I know it was a stupid decision, I'm unable to bring myself to feel any sort of regret for it. The day I gave in started off terribly, with my period having decided to start a day earlier than usual. I don't feel very positively about my reproductive system at the best of times, and my distaste only grows deeper when it decides to punish me for not getting pregnant with a torrent of blood. After dealing with that unfortunate surprise, I was then faced with my bi-weekly phone call with my mother, during which I had to play the unfortunate role of dutiful daughter, gritting my teeth whenever she referred to me by the name she gave me instead of my real one, and clenching my hand into a fist as I expressed in the politest tones that I could muster that, no, I did not have a boyfriend yet. When she started to go on a rant about the latest news story she'd seen about woke indoctrination in schools, I made up some excuse about poor connection and ended the call. Then it was time for work. The gendered politeness of the South is truly a tailor-made hell for people like me, and that day saw a constant stream of ma'ams and misses that culminated in an elderly gentleman remarking, "If you don't mind me saying, miss, you are quite the beautiful young woman," while I tried very hard not to strangle him. But really, truly, I think that the deciding factor that made me open up that box and try my luck with my anonymous benefactor's vial of mystery fluid was the text message I received as I walked through my front door, informing me that my consultation had been postponed again. I'll be honest, when I readied that first injection, part of me hoped it was poison. It wasn't a large part of me, but that urge to just give up, embrace the call of the void and descend into a peaceful oblivion, it was there. To sleep, perchance to dream, as Shakespeare put it. When non-existence no longer frightens you, it is far easier to take risks. I didn't use the syringe that came with the box. While it seemed to be in pristine condition, I didn't trust something that looked that old, and I certainly had no desire to contract tetanus or something. I walked down to the farm supply store across from my apartment building and purchased some sterile syringes and needles there instead. When I got back to the apartment, I spent a few minutes looking up where was best to inject, how to make sure I avoided pricking any veins and arteries, etc., until I finally felt fairly confident that I could actually do it successfully. There was no stalling after that. I didn't want to give myself a chance to change my mind. I popped the cork on the vial, got a milliliter of that strange purple fluid into the syringe, and plunged the needle into my thigh. It hurt far less than I thought it would, if I'm being honest. If you'd asked me before that day, If I would have been able to perform injections myself, I'd have told you no. I've always felt slightly uncomfortable whenever I had to get a vaccine or have a blood test done. Something about needles just made me deeply nervous. But this felt right, and outside of a slight pinch and some pressure as I pushed down the plunger, it was largely painless. I pulled out the needle and applied a small bandage to the tiny puncture mark, though the needle was so thin no blood actually welled up at all. Then I went to bed early, hoping that tomorrow would be a better day. I woke up the next morning writing down my latest dream on my blog in the haze of half-consciousness, and then got out of bed, pleasantly noting that I was not, in fact, dead. Whatever the liquid in the vial was, it at the very least wasn't toxic. There wasn't even so much as a raised bump at the injection site. Thus began my routine of injecting the purplish mystery fluid into my thigh every Friday before bed. Just as the note said, it was around the 4-week mark when I started to actually see results. I was washing my face as part of my morning routine when I noticed something faint on my upper lip. I looked closer to see it was a few dark hairs sprouting out from the previously smooth skin of my face. Excitedly, I looked closer, seeing with delight that all over my jaw, here and there, little hairs were poking up from my flesh. I was beginning to grow facial hair. As a matter of fact, on closer inspection of the rest of me, I was beginning to grow more hair all over my body. It wasn't as though I'd awoken looking like Bigfoot, but it was a noticeable change from my appearance the night before. I was ecstatic. Now, I have to be honest here. I didn't actually know exactly how quickly testosterone was supposed to work, nor what the exact effects were. It may seem lazy, but I never really had sat down to read out how long it would take, what specific results I could expect to see, etc. I think a part of me always saw it as a borderline unachievable fantasy, so there was no reason for me to ever look up the details. However, even I should have known better than to think what happened was normal. For one thing, the injections worked fast. Once the 4-week mark was hit and the changes began, it was like a dam had broken. By 5 weeks, my voice was already starting to deepen. 6 weeks in, and I was able to grow a faint mustache. 7 weeks, and I had chest hair. Looking back on it now, it should have been obvious to me that this was too fast. These sorts of things take months and years to accomplish, not weeks. There was a faint tinge of nervousness during the 12th week, as I looked at myself in the mirror and realized I was taller than I was before. It was the first hint that something was wrong. Testosterone can do a lot of things, but it can't change your bone structure. That wasn't the only sign that something was off. I began to get these feelings of déjà vu on occasion, about once a week, and I could never place exactly what it was. I didn't keep track of every time it happened, obviously, but I do remember a few of the most noteworthy examples. The first time was when I was doing a bit of shopping downtown and saw a street performer, a clown riding atop a penny-farthing bicycle. He wasn't frightening at all. I've never been afraid of clowns. But there was something unsettling about him. He didn't seem to fit in with his surroundings as he glided through the crowd, occasionally honking his horn and taking his hands off the handlebars to juggle some balls. Nobody else seemed to pay him any mind, though. They just kept on walking past him. He seemed so familiar, and I struggled to try and remember if I'd seen him in some viral video or something. I stood there, watching him for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. His movements were fluid, almost too perfect, as if he were a character in a meticulously animated film rather than a flesh-and-blood human being. The way his painted smile never wavered, even as he performed increasingly complex tricks, sent a chill down my spine. I found myself wondering how he managed to balance on that ridiculous bicycle with its enormous front wheel and tiny back one. It seemed to defy the laws of physics. As I watched, transfixed, the clown suddenly turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes, which I hadn't been able to see clearly before, were an unnatural shade of violet. They seemed to glow slightly, even in the bright daylight. For a moment I felt as if I were falling into those eyes, losing myself in their depths. Then he winked at me, a quick conspiratorial gesture, and pedaled away, disappearing into the crowd as if he'd never been there at all. I shook my head, trying to clear it of the strange fog that had settled over my thoughts. As I looked around, I realized that no one else seemed to have noticed anything unusual. People were going about their business as if nothing had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen that clown before, but I couldn't for the life of me remember where or when. Another incident I remember was at work. I was selling tickets when a pair of customers walked up to the booth in lockstep. They were identical twins, each the spitting image of the other, and wore the exact same style of formal black suit. "We're here," started the one on the left. "To purchase some tickets," continued the twin on the right. "For the 2 o'clock show," finished the first twin. The pair of them frankly freaked me out, but I didn't want to be rude, so I did as they asked and got them their tickets. They paid in cash using only $2 bills. They bowed in unison after I handed them their tickets, and then marched in time to the theater I had indicated. I actually checked the purchase logs later to make sure I hadn't imagined it all, as well as looking in the register to see if their $2 bills were still there, and everything was still there. Like with the clown, the oddest part was that they seemed so familiar, as if their names were right on the tip of my tongue. As I watched them walk away, I couldn't help but notice how in sync their movements were. It was as if they were one person split into two bodies, each step perfectly mirrored by the other. Their black suits seemed to absorb the light around them, creating an almost imperceptible distortion in the air as they moved. I blinked hard, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. For the rest of my shift, I found myself glancing towards the theater they had entered, half expecting them to emerge at any moment. But they never did. When the movie ended and people began filing out, I watched carefully, but the twins were nowhere to be seen. I even asked my co-worker who was cleaning the theater if he had seen two identical men in black suits, but he just looked at me strangely and shook his head. That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, their synchronized voices echoed in my head. "We're here to purchase some tickets for the 2 o'clock show," over and over like a broken record. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that I had encountered something profoundly unnatural. I had another encounter at a thrift store. I was shopping for some new clothes. My increased height was making some of my older outfits not fit particularly well. When I was approached by a short gentleman with white hair, who asked me, "Can I help you to find anything, sir?" I turned to respond that I was fine when I noticed that his eyes were two different colors, one blue, one brown. Something about this made my mind scream at me to remember that this was someone who I had met before, but I just couldn't place my finger on why. I stuttered out some non-committal grunt, and he nodded before walking away. I stumbled out of the thrift store without buying anything and went straight home. As I hurried down the street, I couldn't shake the image of those mismatched eyes from my mind. They had seemed to look right through me, as if the old man could see every secret I'd ever kept. His voice, too, had been odd. It had a musical quality to it, almost like he was singing his words rather than speaking them. And the way he had called me sir, it had been perfect, exactly the way I had always dreamed of being addressed. Too perfect, perhaps. I found myself looking over my shoulder repeatedly on the way home, half expecting to see the white-haired man following me. But the streets were normal, filled with the usual crowd of shoppers and workers going about their day. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my heart racing. What was happening to me? Why did everything suddenly feel so strange, so dreamlike? The most recent incident is what made me put all the pieces together. I was taking a nighttime walk, something I felt more comfortable doing now due to my increased bulk and deeper voice. I felt safer knowing that any creeps would be less likely to see me as a potential target. Plus, I'd been hitting the gym, so I felt confident in my ability to fight off anyone who'd try. I was thinking about how much my life had improved since I'd gotten the package, and wondering about what I'd do once the vial had run out. There were only a couple of doses left, but my HRT consultation was only a few days away. Should I try and get more of what I was already taking, or should I switch over to a more legitimate source? It wasn't as though I had any method through which to contact my anonymous benefactor. As I pondered this, I heard a faint hissing noise from a nearby alley, a psst, like someone was trying to beckon me inside. I peered down the alleyway cautiously, trying to get a good look at whoever was trying to attract my attention. I could see the faint outline of a figure hidden partially by the shadows, but I couldn't make out any details. I gently touched my pocket knife just to remind myself it was still there, and then stepped into the alley. I know it sounds like a stupid decision, and it was, but at that moment, I thought that they may have been the mysterious friend who'd given me the vial in the first place. I figured they may have wanted to deliver the next supply in person, and frankly, I wanted to thank them for changing my life. I was still nervous, of course I was, but after all that had happened, I didn't want to seem ungrateful. I stepped into the alley cautiously and made my way over to the figure. They hissed at me again, beckoning for me to come closer with a gloved hand. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw that they were a thin man in a long overcoat, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and, despite the night, a pair of dark sunglasses. They looked like some sort of secret agent stock character. His mouth was stretched wide in a toothy grin. When I was about 10 feet from him, I stopped and asked, "Hello, are you the person who gave me the package? With the vial?" Without moving a muscle on his face, he hissed at me again and then held up his hand in front of his face. Using his other hand, he began to slowly pull off the glove. It was hard to tell at first, in the darkness of the alley, what exactly I was seeing, besides the simple fact that the human brain has difficulty recognizing that which ought not to be. His fingers shone slightly as they moved sinuously in the pale reflected light of the faraway street lamps, glittering like stars. Then he began to walk towards me with shaky steps, and I realized with a sudden shock what I was looking at. The man's fingers were snakes. I tried to back away, but he lunged for me, hissing erupting from his writhing fingers as they latched onto my shoulder, extending out several feet from his arm. I didn't feel them break skin, however. Fortunately, my denim jacket seemed to take the brunt of it. I slashed at the wriggling serpents with my pocket knife and ran when they retreated from the flashing blade. I kept running all the way home and didn't stop running until I was safely in my apartment with the door firmly locked and bolted. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I leaned against the door. I could still hear the hissing in my ears, could still feel the phantom touch of those snake fingers on my shoulder. I stumbled to the bathroom, stripping off my jacket as I went, half expecting to see puncture marks or traces of venom on my skin. But there was nothing. No marks, no pain, nothing to indicate that what I had just experienced was real. And yet, I knew it had been. The torn fabric of my jacket was proof enough of that. As I stared at my reflection in the mirror, I saw a face I barely recognized anymore. My jawline was stronger, my shoulders broader, my voice deeper when I whispered, "What's happening to me?" to my reflection. I looked like the man I had always wanted to be, but at what cost? Despite the completely surreal and impossible nature of what had just happened, it all felt so familiar. And finally, the gears in my brain started to move, and I realized what it was that linked all of the strange interactions I had. I turned on my computer and went to check my blog, searching up keywords and reading through my recorded dreams with a sense of dawning horror. September 12th, 2023. Dreamed I was a lion tamer in some sort of circus. The lions were full of stuffing. One accidentally got caught on some fencing and was ripped open. The audience loved it. They were still heavy, though. I lifted one up and everyone cheered. I guess I was a strong man as well as a lion tamer. Dream ended with a clown on an old-fashioned bicycle, riding across a tightrope over a big pool of water. The ringmaster said the pool was full of piranhas, but all I saw were what looked like eels or big worms. I woke up when the clown fell off his bike. October 24th, 2023. I was a knight, going to save a princess who was trapped in a big floating tower, accompanied by a sloth for some reason. On the way there, encountered a very polite two-headed ogre. Each head would finish the other's sentences, and it would bow at me frequently. Eventually reached the tower, but the princess was happy there and told me to go away. Woke up soon after. November 17th, 2023. In an old library, trying to do some research for something, can't remember what. Went to go get help from a librarian, but he was a husky with two different colored eyes, one blue, one brown. Got distracted by this and we got to talking for the rest of the dream, my research forgotten. It was very philosophical, but I can't actually really remember what we talked about much. He did call me a handsome young man, though. January 2nd, 2024. Nightmare. Man made of snakes. Don't want to think about it. I sat back in my chair, one hand over my mouth. I felt sick. This wasn't possible. This wasn't something that could be real. I told myself that I must be hallucinating, that it couldn't possibly be real life. But then I looked over at the shoulder of my jacket and noticed the bite marks in the rough fabric. There was even a broken-off fang sticking out. I thought about the strange twins and their $2 bills in the register. Besides, it wasn't as though I was the only person who had noticed the changes to my body. My friends and co-workers had commented on it. Customers addressed me as Sir. I had to buy new clothes to fit my changed physique. This was real. Whatever it was I had been taking, it was making my dreams into reality. As I scrolled through my blog, more and more connections became apparent. The clown on the penny farthing, the twins finishing each other's sentences, the old man with heterochromia. They were all there, hidden in the depths of my subconscious, now brought to life by whatever was in that vial. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the implications. If my dreams could become reality, what about my nightmares? I thought about all the times I'd woken up in a cold sweat, heart racing from some terrifying dream I could barely remember. What horrors lurked in the recesses of my mind, waiting to be unleashed upon the world? And what about the dreams I couldn't remember at all? How many strange encounters had I had that I couldn't connect to a specific dream, simply because I hadn't written it down? There was a knock on my front door. I got up and checked the peephole, but nobody was there. Opening the door, I saw a new package, wrapped up in brown paper and tied up with string. It was addressed to Dysphoric Dreamer 98. I don't know what to do from here. I've spent the past day just going through all the posts on my blog tagged Nightmare, weighing the pros and cons of continuing my treatment. The package lies unopened on my kitchen table for now. You've got to understand, this substance, whatever it is, has made me happier than I've ever been before. But I'm worried for my safety. I got lucky this time, I managed to get away, but what about the next time? And the time after that? Do I risk acting out my nightmares in the waking world to live the life that makes me happy? To make matters worse, I got a text message. My consultation has once again been pushed back another 3 weeks. I don't even have the luxury of a third option. I have to choose between going cold turkey or sticking with whatever my friend has sent me. As I sit here, staring at the unopened package, I can't help but wonder about the nature of reality itself. If my dreams can become real, what does that mean for the world around me? Are the people I see every day real, or are they just figments of my imagination, brought to life by this strange substance? And what about me? Am I still the person I was before I started taking the vial's contents, or have I become something else entirely? The changes to my body are real enough. I can see them, feel them, and others have noticed them too. But what about the changes to my mind? I've always wanted to be seen and treated as a man, but now that it's happening, I find myself questioning everything. Is this really who I am? Or is it just another dream, albeit a waking one? I think about Timothy. The boy from high school who was brave enough to live as his true self long before I found the courage to do so. I wonder where he is now, if he's happy, if he ever got the medical care he needed. I feel a pang of guilt for not standing up for him back then, for letting my own fear and jealousy keep me silent. And then there are my parents. What would they think if they could see me now? Would they finally accept me as their son, or would they be horrified by what I've become? Part of me wants to call them, to try and explain, but I know it would be futile. They wouldn't understand. They couldn't understand. As the sun begins to set outside my window, I realize I've been sitting here for hours, lost in thought. The unopened package on my kitchen table seems to mock me, a Schrodinger's cat of possibilities. What's inside? More of the mysterious substance that has changed my life so dramatically, or something else entirely, something born from the darker corners of my subconscious. I stand up, stretching my now unfamiliar body, and walk to the kitchen. I make myself a cup of coffee, even though I know I probably shouldn't be drinking caffeine this late. The bitter taste grounds me, reminding me that no matter how surreal my life has become, some things remain constant. As I sip my coffee, I think about the changes I've experienced. It's not just the physical transformations, though those are significant enough. It's the way people treat me now, the respect in their voices when they call me sir, the way other men nod at me in passing. It's the confidence I feel walking down the street at night, no longer afraid of every shadow. But at what cost? The incident in the alley flashes through my mind again, and I shudder. The snake-fingered man could have killed me. And what about the other dreams, the ones I can't remember? What horrors might be lurking in my subconscious, waiting to be made real? I think about my job at the movie theater, about my coworkers and the regular customers. How many of them have noticed the changes in me? Do they suspect anything? Or do they simply accept it as they would any other gradual transformation? I wonder if I should quit, move to a new city where no one knows me, start fresh, as the man I've always known myself to be. But then I think about my blog, about the other trans men who read my posts and find solace in knowing they're not alone. What would happen to them if I suddenly disappeared? And what about the mysterious benefactor who sent me the vial in the first place? Would they find me, no matter where I went? I finish my coffee and rinse out the mug, my movements automatic as my mind continues to race. I think about the HRT consultation, now pushed back yet again. Part of me wonders if it's even worth pursuing anymore. After all, I've achieved in weeks what would normally take years of hormone therapy. But another part of me craves the legitimacy, the safety of doing things the right way. As night falls, I find myself standing in front of my bedroom mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in days. The face that looks back at me is the one I've always seen in my dreams, strong-jawed and masculine. My shoulders are broader, my chest flatter. I look like the man I've always known myself to be. But as I stare into my own eyes, I see something else there too. A hint of fear, a shadow of doubt. Who am I really? Am I still myself? Or have I become someone or something else entirely? I think about all the stories I've read, all the movies I've seen about people who make deals with mysterious forces to get what they want. It always ends badly for them. But then again, those are just stories. This is real life, isn't it? I crawl into bed, my mind still swirling with thoughts and questions. As I drift off to sleep, I wonder what I'll dream about tonight. And more importantly, I wonder what might become real tomorrow. The next morning, I wake up feeling groggy and disoriented. For a moment, I can't remember where I am or what's been happening. Then it all comes flooding back, the vial, the changes, the nightmarish encounters. I sit up quickly, my heart pounding, half expecting to see the snake-fingered man standing in the corner of my room. But there's nothing there, just the familiar surroundings of my bedroom, bathed in the soft light of early morning. I take a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It's then that I notice something on my nightstand. a small piece of paper that wasn't there when I went to bed. With trembling hands, I pick it up. It's another note, written in the same elegant cursive as the one that came with the original package. The choice is yours, dream or wake. But remember, not all that is real is true, and not all that is true is real. Choose wisely. I stare at the note, reading it over and over again. What does it mean? Who left it here? I'm certain I locked all the doors and windows before going to bed. The implications are terrifying. Someone or something was in my room while I slept, watching me, leaving messages. I get out of bed and do a thorough check of my apartment. Everything is locked, just as I left it. There's no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone else has been here. And yet, the note sits on my nightstand, undeniably real. As I stand in my living room, feeling more lost and confused than ever, my eyes fall on the unopened package on the kitchen table. The choice is yours, the note said. But what choice? To continue taking the mysterious substance, knowing it's changing not just my body, but the very fabric of reality around me. Or to stop, to try and go back to the way things were before. I think about my life before the vial. The dysphoria, the constant feeling of wrongness, the fear and self-loathing. Can I really go back to that, now that I've experienced what it's like to truly be myself? But then I think about the nightmarish encounters, the blurring of dreams and reality. Is this really the price I have to pay for happiness? I sit down at my kitchen table, the unopened package in front of me. I know that whatever decision I make will change my life forever. There's no going back, no middle ground. I have to choose. I hope I make the right decision. The crisp autumn air bit at my exposed skin as I stepped out of my SUV, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway leading up to my father's old cabin. Well, my cabin now. The thought still felt strange, even after all these years. I'm Valadin, 25 years old, and this piece of land nestled in the Kentucky wilderness has been my sanctuary since my father passed away 6 years ago. As I shouldered my heavy backpack and grabbed my rifle case, memories flooded back. I could almost hear my father's gruff voice, his thick Russian accent softened by years in America, but never quite gone. Always be prepared, Valadin, he'd say. Nature is beautiful, but she can be cruel. I smiled wryly at the memory. My father had been many things: a former VDV soldier, a stern parent, and above all, a survivor. He'd brought me to America when I was just 10, leaving behind the cold streets of Vladivostok and my mother, who chose to stay behind when they divorced. It wasn't an easy transition, but my father was determined to give me a better life. The cabin loomed before me, a sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs that had weathered countless storms. It wasn't much to look at, but it was home. More than that, it was a testament to my father's strength and the legacy he left behind. As I approached the porch, I noticed the worn Soviet flag still hanging by the door, faded but proud. My father might have left Russia, but Russia never quite left him. I ran my fingers over the familiar fabric before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The interior was just as I remembered it, Spartan but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by shelves lined with books on survival, military history, and Russian literature. The air was stale, tinged with the scent of old wood and memories. I set about opening windows and airing out the place. As I moved around the cabin, my eyes fell on the framed photos on the mantel. There was one of my father in his VDV uniform, looking young and fierce. Next to it, a picture of the two of us on my high school graduation day. His proud smile belied the pain he must have been feeling. We'd learned about his cancer diagnosis just a week before. Shaking off the melancholy, I focused on the task at hand. I was here to prepare for a camping trip with my old friend James. We drifted apart after high school, but he'd reached out recently, asking if I wanted to go camping. It seemed like a good opportunity to reconnect. I began unpacking my gear clothes, including my father's old VDV uniform, a cherished memento. MREs, and of course my rifle and ammunition. Some might think 500 rounds excessive for a camping trip, but my father's voice echoed in my head. Better to have and not need than to need and not have. As I arranged my supplies, my mind wandered back to the day my father and I first arrived in Kentucky. It was a warm summer day, so different from the bitter cold of Vladivostok. I remember feeling overwhelmed by the lush green landscape, so unlike the industrial gray of my hometown. My father had squeezed my shoulder and said, "This is our new beginning, Valadin. We make it what we want." Those first few months were tough. My broken English made me an easy target for bullies at school, and my father struggled to find work that matched his skills. But we persevered. My father took odd jobs during the day and spent his evenings teaching me English and the survival skills he'd learned in the military. It was during one of these lessons that he first brought me to this cabin. He'd won it in a poker game, he said, though I always suspected there was more to that story. The place was run down then, barely more than a shack. But over the years, we rebuilt it together, turning it into a sanctuary from the world. As the sun began to set, I lit a fire in the hearth and settled in with a bottle of vodka, another habit inherited from my father. The familiar burn in my throat was comforting as I leaned back in the old armchair, lost in thought. My mind wandered to James and our upcoming trip. I'd invited my friend Grisha along too, not wanting to feel like a third wheel with James and his new girlfriend. Unfortunately, Grisha couldn't make it due to work commitments. It would just be the three of us then. Grisha was one of the few friends who stuck by me in those early days. He was a fellow outsider, the son of Ukrainian immigrants who understood what it was like to straddle two worlds. We bonded over our shared experiences and our love for the outdoors. Many weekends were spent in these woods, learning to track animals, build shelters, and start fires without matches. As the vodka worked its magic, my eyelids grew heavy. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound outside. Groggy and disoriented, I fumbled for my watch. To my shock, I'd slept for nearly a day. Cursing under my breath, I stumbled to the kitchen to brew some much-needed coffee. As the rich aroma filled the cabin, I heard the distinct sound of tires on gravel. James must be here. Still nursing my hangover, I grabbed my rifle out of habit and peered out the window. A beat-up Dodge Ram was making its way up the driveway, country music blaring loud enough to wake the dead. I relaxed, recognizing James behind the wheel. But as the truck drew closer, my blood ran cold. Sitting in the passenger seat wasn't some stranger. It was Alicia, my ex-girlfriend. My stomach churned, and it wasn't just the hangover. Alicia and I had broken up less than 3 months ago, and the wounds were still fresh. What the hell was James thinking, bringing her here? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe this was a chance to clear the air, to move past the bitterness of our breakup. But as I watched them climb out of the truck, Alicia's face set in a scowl. I knew this weekend was going to be anything but relaxing. They entered the cabin, and an uncomfortable silence fell over us. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. James, oblivious to the undercurrents, grinned and said, "Man, you guys are pretty awkward. Have you met before?" I felt a surge of anger at his cluelessness. "Ask her," I spat out, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Alicia's face contorted with rage. "Listen, you Euro trash," she hissed. "You're the one who said I could come. We don't need your crap to start." James, finally catching on that something was amiss, asked Alicia to calm down. They stepped outside, and I could hear the low murmur of their voices as she presumably filled him in on our history. As I waited, my mind raced back to the day Alicia and I broke up. We'd been together for almost a year, and I thought things were going well. But then I caught her texting her ex, making plans to meet up behind my back. When I confronted her, she turned it around on me, accusing me of being paranoid and controlling. The argument that followed was ugly, full of shouted accusations and bitter words. In the end, she stormed out, leaving me with a shattered heart and a deep sense of betrayal. When James returned, his face was a mask of fury. Without warning, he slapped me hard across the face. "Why did you cheat on her?" he demanded. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't cheated. It was the other way around. The injustice of it all, coupled with the stinging pain in my cheek, pushed me over the edge. With a roar of anger, I lunged at James, my fist connecting solidly with his jaw. In one fluid motion, I pinned him against the wall, my forearm pressed against his throat. "What's your problem?" I growled, my face inches from his. James spat in my face, his eyes blazing with defiance. "Let me go!" he choked out. I was about to retort when a scream from outside pierced the air. Alicia burst through the door, her face pale with terror. "I saw someone outside!" she gasped. I released James, who slumped against the wall, gasping for breath. We both turned to Alicia, our argument momentarily forgotten. "What do you mean you saw someone?" James asked, rubbing his throat. Alicia's voice trembled as she spoke. "I saw a big man in the woods. He looked like he was wearing a goat mask." My first instinct was disbelief. This was my family's land, isolated and miles from the nearest neighbor. The idea of some psycho hillbilly satanic cultist lurking in the woods seemed absurd. But the fear in Alicia's eyes was real. "This is my family land," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "There's no one around for miles. The closest neighbor is 5 miles away." Alicia's fear quickly turned to anger. "You arsehole," she spat. "If you don't go look, I'm going to call the cops and say you hit me." The threat hung in the air, heavy and ominous. I knew she was capable of following through, and the last thing I wanted was to deal with the police. With a resigned sigh, I grabbed my father's old rifle. As I moved towards the door, I turned to James. "You really just gonna sit here and let her do this?" I asked, disappointment clear in my voice. "You're some kind of friend." The night air was cool on my skin as I stepped outside. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. I loaded a 30-round magazine into my rifle and said a silent prayer to St. Michael, just as my father had taught me. I moved cautiously towards the back of the cabin, my rifle held at the ready. The forest loomed dark and imposing before me. A twig snapped somewhere in the shadows, and I swung my rifle towards the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stood there scanning the tree line, memories of my childhood in these woods flooded back. I remembered my father teaching me to move silently through the underbrush, to read the signs left by animals, to navigate by the stars. He always said that the forest was alive, that it had its own spirit and will. "Respect it," he'd say, "and it will protect you. Disrespect it, and it will swallow you whole." Suddenly, I heard the cabin door slam shut behind me, followed by the sound of car doors and an engine roaring to life. James's truck peeled out of the driveway. His voice carried on the wind. "Screw you and your communist dad." I stood there, stunned by their sudden departure. But before I could process what had happened, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was James's voice again, but wrong. It sounded like an animal trying to form words, repeating what James had just said. Then I smelled it, that sickly sweet odor of rotten eggs that I'd noticed earlier. My father's training kicked in, and I began shouting in Russian, hoping to intimidate whatever was out there. That's when I saw them, a pair of yellow eyes, glowing in the darkness. They were at least 8 feet off the ground, far too high to belong to any normal animal. A primal fear gripped me, but I pushed it down, channeling it into anger instead. Without thinking, I emptied my entire magazine into the darkness where I'd seen the eyes. The forest erupted with the sound of gunfire, and I could hear something large crashing through the underbrush. As soon as the last shot rang out, I slammed a fresh magazine into the rifle and began backing towards the cabin. Once inside, I threw the heavy bar across the door and collapsed into a chair, my heart racing. For hours, I sat there in the darkness, listening. I could hear it outside, still mimicking voices, mine, James, Alicia's, repeating snippets of our conversation from earlier. As the night wore on, my mind raced with possibilities. What had I seen out there? Was it some kind of animal or something else? I thought back to the stories my father used to tell, tales from his homeland of creatures that lurked in the dark places of the world. At the time, I dismissed them as fairy tales meant to scare children into behaving. Now I wasn't so sure. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep. My dreams were a chaotic mix of memories and nightmares. I saw my father, young and strong in his VDV uniform, fighting shadows that moved like smoke. I saw Alicia, her face twisted into an inhuman snarl, chasing me through endless woods. And always, always, there were those glowing yellow eyes, watching from the darkness. When I awoke, the sun was streaming through the windows, and the woods were silent, save for the normal sounds of birds and small animals. I quickly packed my things, my hands shaking slightly as I did so. As I drove away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The woods that had once been a sanctuary now felt alien and threatening. I never heard from James or Alicia again after that night. Part of me was glad for that, but another part wondered if they had encountered something on their drive home, something that might explain their sudden departure. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just a bear driven to unusual behavior by hunger or disease. Maybe the stress and alcohol had caused me to hallucinate. But deep down, I knew these explanations rang hollow. I threw myself into research, poring over local legends and folklore. I discovered stories of strange creatures in these hills, passed down through generations of settlers and Native Americans alike. Tales of shapeshifters, of spirits that could mimic human voices, of things that lurked at the edges of firelight, waiting for the unwary. The more I learned, the more I began to see connections. The rotten egg smell sulfur, associated with demonic presence in many cultures. The ability to mimic voices, a trait ascribed to skinwalkers in Navajo legend. The glowing eyes, a common feature in stories of supernatural beasts across the world. But knowledge brought little comfort. If anything, it only deepened the sense of unease that had taken root in my soul. The world suddenly seemed larger, darker, full of hidden dangers I'd never considered before. In the years since, I've returned to the cabin many times. I've never seen anything like what I saw that night, but I can never quite shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear voices in the trees, familiar voices, saying things I'd rather forget. Each time I visit, I find myself drawn deeper into the woods, searching for something. Answers, perhaps. Or maybe I'm looking for that thing, hoping to confront it, to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But the forest keeps its secrets well, and I always return empty-handed. My father always said that nature could be cruel, but he never mentioned that it could be cunning too. Whatever is out there in those woods, it's patient, and I can't help but feel that one day it will be waiting for me again. As I sit here now, writing this down, I can't help but wonder, was it all real? Or was it just the product of too much vodka, old resentments, and the wild imagination that comes with isolation? Part of me hopes it was all in my head, but a larger part, the part that remembers those glowing eyes and that horrible, mocking voice, knows better. The woods are quiet now, but I know better than to trust the silence. Whatever is out there, it's waiting. And one day, I fear, it will make itself known again. Until then, I'll keep my rifle close and my senses sharp. After all, that's what my father would have done. And in these woods, on this land that bridges my past and my present, being my father's son is the only thing that keeps the shadows at bay. But there's something else, something I haven't told anyone. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the moon is high and the woods are at their quietest, I hear it, a whisper, barely audible, calling my name. It sounds like my father's voice, but wrong, distorted, as if something is wearing his voice like an ill-fitting suit. The first time I heard it, I was certain I was dreaming. I jolted awake, sweat-soaked and trembling, to find the cabin bathed in silvery moonlight. The whisper came again from just outside my window. "Valadin," it said, in that not quite right version of my father's voice. "Come out, boy. I have so much to show you." I lay there, frozen in terror, until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. When I finally mustered the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. No footprints in the dewy grass. No sign that anything had been prowling around the cabin in the night. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a product of stress and unresolved grief over my father's death. But it happened again, and again. Each time the voice grew a little clearer, a little more insistent, and each time I felt a pull, an almost irresistible urge to step outside and follow it into the depths of the forest. It was after one of these nights that I decided to dig deeper into my father's past. I knew he had been in the VDV, the Russian Airborne Forces, but he rarely spoke about his time in the service. Now, driven by a mix of curiosity and growing unease, I began to pore over the few documents and mementos he'd left behind. Most of it was what I expected: commendations, photographs of young soldiers with serious faces, technical manuals for various weapons and equipment. But tucked away in the bottom of an old footlocker, I found something else. A journal, its pages yellow with age, filled with my father's cramped Cyrillic handwriting. My Russian was rusty, but as I deciphered the entries, a chill ran down my spine. My father wrote of a mission gone wrong in the remote Siberian wilderness. His unit had been dispatched to investigate reports of strange lights and unexplained disappearances in a small village near the Tunguska River. What they found there defied explanation. The village was empty, but not abandoned. Meals sat half-eaten on tables, clothes hung to dry on lines, but there wasn't a single person to be found. And in the surrounding forest, they encountered something. My father's descriptions were vague, as if he struggled to put into words what he had seen. But a few details stood out: yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, the stench of rotting eggs, and voices that mimicked the missing villagers calling out from the woods. The mission ended in disaster. Of the 12 men who entered that forest, only my father and 2 others made it out alive. The official report blamed it on a combination of harsh conditions, equipment failure, and unspecified hostile forces. But my father's journal told a different story. He believed they had encountered something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting in those woods for centuries. And worse, he feared that by entering its domain, they had somehow drawn its attention to the outside world. The final entry in the journal was dated just a week before we left for America. In it, my father wrote of strange dreams, of feeling watched even in the heart of Vladivostok. He said he had to leave, to get as far away as possible, and he hoped that by crossing the ocean, he could leave whatever it was behind. Now, as I sit in this cabin my father and I built together, I can't help but wonder, did it follow him? Did it follow us? Is that what's out there in these Kentucky woods, calling to me with my father's voice? The rational part of my mind says it's impossible. The thing my father described, if it ever existed at all, is half a world away. But another part of me, the part that remembers those glowing eyes in the forest and that horrible mimicking voice, isn't so sure. I've thought about leaving, about selling the cabin and moving somewhere far away, somewhere with no forests or dark places for things to hide. But I can't. This land, this cabin, it's all I have left of my father. And more than that, I feel a responsibility. If there is something out there, something that followed us across the world, then I'm the only one who knows about it. The only one who might be able to stop it, if it ever decides to do more than whisper from the shadows. So I stay. I maintain the cabin, I hike the trails, and I keep watch. I've installed motion-activated cameras around the property, though they've yet to capture anything unusual. I've reached out to some of the old-timers in the area, trying to gather local legends and stories that might shed some light on what I experienced. Most dismiss me as an outsider with an overactive imagination, but a few have shared tales that make me think I'm not the first to encounter strangeness in these woods. There's Old Man Pritchard, who lives about 10 miles down the road. He told me about the time back in the 70s when a whole family disappeared from a cabin not far from here. The police investigation turned up nothing, but Pritchard swears he saw lights moving through the woods that night, lights that seemed to whisper as they passed. Then there's Maria Running Deer, a Cherokee elder I met at a local market. When I hesitantly asked her about legends of shapeshifters or mimics in the area, her eyes widened. She told me of an old story passed down through her family, of a time long ago when her ancestors fought a war against creatures that could steal voices and wear skins like clothes. The battle was won, she said, but at a great cost. The few creatures that survived were sealed away in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest. "But seals can break," she warned me, her aged hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. "And hungry things don't forget." These stories, combined with my father's journal and my own experiences, have led me to a chilling conclusion. Whatever is out there, it's old, ancient, and it's patient. It might wait years, decades, even centuries between appearances, but it never truly goes away. So I've made it my mission to learn everything I can. I've filled notebooks with research on folklore, cryptozoology, and the occult. I've trained myself in tracking and wilderness survival beyond even what my father taught me. And I've prepared the cabin, turning it into a fortress against the darkness. Salt lines at every threshold, iron nails in the door frames, protective symbols from a dozen different cultures carved discreetly into the logs. Some might call me paranoid. Hell, some days I wonder if I'm losing my mind. But then I remember the terror of that night, the inhuman yellow eyes, and the voice that was mine but not mine. And I know that no matter how long it takes, I have to be ready. Because one day, I'm sure of it, the whispers will become shouts. The shadows will take form. And whatever has been waiting out there in the woods will finally show itself. When that day comes, I'll be ready. I am my father's son, after all. And if there's one thing he taught me, it's that you never back down from a fight, no matter how terrifying the enemy might be. So I wait and I watch, and I listen to the whispers in the woods. And I pray that when the time comes, I'll be strong enough to face what's out there. Because if I'm not, I fear it won't just be me who pays the price. Whatever this thing is, it's been patient for a long time. And I shudder to think what might happen if it ever decides it's done waiting. As the sun sets on another day, casting long shadows across the clearing, I finish writing this account. I'm not sure why I felt compelled to put it all down on paper. Maybe it's a warning, in case something happens to me. Maybe it's a call for help, a message in a bottle cast into the sea of time. Or maybe it's just my way of trying to make sense of the insensible, to bring some order to the chaos that has become my life. Whatever the reason, it's done now. The story is told, as best as I can tell it. And as I sit here on the porch, watching the darkness creep in from the tree line, I find myself straining my ears, listening for that familiar yet alien whisper. The woods are silent for now, but in this silence, I know a truth that both terrifies and strengthens me. The night is long, the forest is vast, and somewhere out there in the darkness, something is waiting and watching, and one day calling my name.